Hey, hello everyone. Welcome back to my channel. Today I had a spark of inspiration and I obviously am doing it. I wanted to go over all of the palettes in my collection that quote unquote check all my boxes. So palettes that I can pull and that I don't, for the most part, or for the majority of the time or the majority of looks I would do with it, I don't feel the need to pull any other palette out. Obviously this is going to really depend on the individual, but for me, when I really sit down and think about it, the things that I consider what I consider a palette to how do I say this? But the things that I need in a palette in order for me to consider like a complete look basically is I want a mid-toned and really deep matte that I can build my crease up with. I'm not including a matte black because I don't mind pulling a matte black. I use a matte black every time I do my eyeshadow, so it's not a deal breaker for me. It's not like something that really is going to upset me if like a palette doesn't have a matte black in it. But if the palette is completely mid-toned and then has a matte black, I also could just use that matte black to deepen it up, which, you know, honestly it will make like more sense, or maybe it'll be easier for me to explain like as I kind of go through these. And I also don't, for myself personally, feel like I quote unquote need, for me, like an inner corner or brow bone shade. Again, like I'm more than happy to use my face highlighter or pull in a single or something. It's not something that is as important to me as having like darker matte shadows. And also I want a shimmer. I want a shimmer to use in the lid, so an all matte palette isn't going to like be a standalone palette for me. So those are kind of like my personal criterias. I also don't now at this point feel like I need a like light kind of blending shade. I prefer it. I prefer having like light, medium, deep shades, but I'm kind of at the point now where I don't mind if there's a mid-tone and a deep matte to blend it out, like blend out my crease with a cream shade, a matte cream shade, or just my face powder or something. Like I don't place as much importance on that as I used to, although I will say I definitely do prefer to have light, medium, deep mattes. And I have to say I'm so pleasantly surprised when I went through all of the palettes that I have and pulled all the ones that I, you know, can create a look with by itself. I have to say it's a lot of my collection, and if you had asked me this before I went and pulled all these palettes, I don't think I would have said that. I would have honestly probably said like 50-50. So it's super helpful for me to have a better understanding of what I actually have in my collection and what my palettes contain. So I'm actually so glad that I did this video, just because of all the things, like just it reminds me what I have. So let's just go into it. I actually, as I mentioned, have a lot of palettes in front of me. I don't even know what order to do these in, to be honest. And I also didn't discriminate between like some palettes I haven't even used, but I know that I wouldn't need anything like else from them. And some palettes are like really old and I've used a ton. So let's start with Beauty Bay, because actually all of my Beauty Bay palettes, except for the Utopia palette, so this is kind of an example of a palette that I would never, for a lot of reasons, use by itself. All of these are mid-tone shades. It's all matte, so I wouldn't really consider this to be used alone. But all the rest of my Beauty Bay palettes I would use alone. So the Berries palette, we have really light mattes, which like I said I don't need, but these really deep shades, and then all these mid-tone shades and these beautiful shimmers. This is what I'm looking for. I want that range of depth. Same with the Beauty Bay Midnight palette. We have even a matte black, which is an extra bonus. Like these truly embody everything that I need to create a look. Light, mid-toned, deep, and then a matte black. I probably would need a darker blue or prefer a darker blue than this, but again, there's that matte black so I can deepen it up. And then the Beauty Bay Earthy palette. Again, we have a range of depths and those beautiful shimmers. This is a little bit iffy for me. Like, I'm including it in here because with my 3 looks on palette that I did, I was able to use this relatively surprisingly comfortably, the Beauty Bay Love Notes palette by itself, but because you have these 2 deeper mattes down here, but the problem is this is the only mid-tone shade. So I could create different looks just using this palette, but I might, for a little bit of tonal variation, pull something in to add to that, but generally speaking, it has everything that I could want to do a full look. Beauty Bay Age of Opulence. Again, I love it. Look at the depth in here and the beautiful shimmers. For me, it's truly all about depth. Beauty Bay Wilderness, yes and no. So we have like this deep blue and this deep green, but I would like a deeper red or like a dark brown to kind of use with this bottom row here. But for a lot of looks, I can use this palette by itself, and I also can use the blue to deepen up this red. So for like 90% of the palette, I could use it by itself. Beauty Bay Sunset Horizons. I've used this a ton, and I've talked at length about how much I love the depth in here. And then Beauty Bay Book of Magic. Again, I've also talked about this at length. Oh my god. Open. Come on. Come on. Talked about this at length and love the deep shades in here as well. And then actually this is probably one of the ones that I would want more depth from, is the Beauty Bay and Jade palette. And definitely there is depth in here. Unfortunately, this shade is a little bit broken, but there's depth in here. There's a matte black, there's this dark blue, there's this dark brown. But I would like a few more deeper shades, especially for how big this palette is, but I can use it alone with relative ease. So hats off to Beauty Bay. We love to see the depth. Although I will say, you don't love their commitment to always including beiges in their palettes. Now let's also do maybe Colourpop and Beige. So starting off with Beige, some of these I've used on my channel. I have a video swatching a lot of these, but some I also actually haven't used. So the 3 that I haven't used but that I know I would use by themselves for the most part is the Looking Like a Snack palette. This I could use by itself because it has this like sequin black, this matte black, but if it wasn't in here, I really wouldn't use it by itself. I would always grab for a deeper shade, but I can use this black as a base to create depth. The Fuck Off palette, which is so cringy, but again, same thing. This deep purple is pretty deep, and as well as this deep green, but I also have this matte black that I could use as a base to create like the base depth. And then there is the Do Not Disturb palette, which maybe is a little bit light for me, but I think this burgundy here would create the depth that I would want and goes with all of these tones. And the other like 16 pan Beige palettes that I have that I really could easily use by themselves, Blueberry Muffin. I've used this before on my channel. I like that this brown is more of like a purpley, almost burgundy brown, so it works actually quite well with the blues in here. If this was more of like a warm toned dark brown, I probably wouldn't put this in here just because it wouldn't really blend into the blues, and then I would only really use that for a more neutral look. But because this has a strong purpleness to it, I can use it by itself. I absolutely love this palette. This is like a prime example of what I want. Avocado Toast from Beige. If there wasn't this matte black in here, I probably wouldn't consider this to be like a palette that I would use by itself. The shade Pit is pretty deep, but it's pretty like warm. So I don't know that I would use that to deepen some of these like grains. I think it would just look super, super muddy. So I do appreciate that that matte black is in there and I can create the depth with that. Same deal with the Smitten in Switzerland palette from BH. By itself, I probably would pull something in if it didn't have this matte black, but I love that it has that matte black. Passion in Paris from BH is another example of a palette that really just has everything I need. It has deep shades, it has a matte black, it even has an inner corner shade. Like, this is quintessential like perfection in a palette for me. The Amore in Amalfi palette from BH is a little bit of a stretch, but I think I could probably use this deep shade to get a good amount of depth. It looks pretty deep, and I find that BH shadows are quite buildable. I haven't actually used this yet, but this to me is like a really nice neutral palette with a dark brown that I love to see. So BH again is like one that typically, they have some palettes that are fully mid-tone, but a lot of the palettes that I have from them are very nice standalone palettes for me. Now Colourpop. So let's start with some of the older ones. There's the Yes Please palette. I love that there's this dark brown. We have like a range of depths, and this is an older palette but still has stood the test of time as a standalone palette for me. Colourpop Good Sport I also love. I love that there's this deep burgundy and this darker green, and I just absolutely love Good Sport. The Zodiac, in collaboration with Kathleen Lights, again has this dark brown and it has this like basically black shade that I really love as well. Not my favorite formula necessarily from Colourpop, but I can use it. I pretty much use it by itself most of the time. And then also Dream Street in collaboration with Kathleen Lights from Colourpop. Again, we have this dark brown. I might pull in something else for using this matte blue or like matte teal, like maybe a mid-tone teal. But for the most part, and the most times that I use this palette, I'm using it by itself. And honestly, I don't reach for the teals in there a ton. And then Main Squeeze from Colourpop is one of the few 9-pan palettes that I find has enough depth for me. The shade Red Bottoms here, this matte like darker red, I do find has enough depth for me to create like kind of a standalone look with this palette as well. So now some of the newer palettes from Colourpop. The Limoncello palette is a palette that is definitely a standalone with this deep brown. It's cool toned enough that I feel like you could use this matte blue blended into it, but if I was going to use that matte blue, I'd probably pull in another palette, but it's just, I mean, one pop of blue in this overall neutral palette, so most of the time I'd go neutral with it. It's so sad that they discontinued this palette. I really, really like it. And then this I recently used in a Colourpop haul that I posted, the High Tide. This, again, I love the depth. There's shimmers. There's also this really light shade like this. And a 9-pan is like the range of the depth fine, but the like I want this amount of depth in my palettes always. And let's also go over some Colourpop palettes that I have that I haven't actually used, but that also show the depth that I want. Like, I'm going all in. I'm taking out all of my palettes. The Orchid You Not, which I'm so excited to pull out. Look at this. Again, this is the depth that I want to see in all of my palettes 100% of the time, okay? The Wine and Only palette from Colourpop as well, like this deep red, purpley red, is also the level of depth that I want to see. And then some of the Star Wars palettes. So the Mandalorian palette has a level of depth that I like. I might like it a little bit deeper, but this dark, like cool toned brown, I think could give me the depth that I want. The Darth Vader palette from Colourpop, again, there's this really like dark sequin shadow that I think would basically perform as a matte, and then we have this really beautiful deep burgundy that would give me the depth that I want. I'm really excited to use these palettes. And then finally from Colourpop, the Cabana Club palette, which I believe is discontinued. So I don't know, I haven't used it yet, but this dark purpley brown would give me the depth that I would want from this palette. Okay, let's go over another brand that pretty much every palette that I have from them is a standalone palette pretty much. Huda Beauty. So Desert Dusk is the first Huda Beauty palette I ever bought, and this dark shade Oud is deep enough for me to deepen up most of my looks. I might choose a different shade now where I'm at to deepen up this purple, but I did used to use this palette a ton and combine these two shades. And for most of the looks that I would do with this palette, I'd use it by itself. The Rose Quartz palette, again, I haven't used extensively, but I love that this deep purple shade is included, and this is kind of what makes the palette for me. I mean, as well as all of these beautiful shimmers. And even there's one like Coral Obsessions palette that I don't use by itself, but all of the other 9-pan palettes that I have from Huda are standalone palettes for me. So we have the Wild Jaguar. If this matte black, it wasn't in here, I'd probably, oh my god, I can't even hold it, but I'd probably use maybe something else, but this deep shade is pretty, or this brown shade is pretty deep as well, so I love the depth in there. The Nude Rich palette. I love this deep purpley brown. The Wild Python palette, this dark brown shade is quite deep, so I could use it as well to create like a grungy colorful look and deepen up some of these brighter colors. I'd probably bring in a darker blue if I wanted to go full blue, but I think I could create a ton of looks with this just as a standalone palette. And then the Khaki Haze. This is a little bit more in the fence, but I think that I could build this dark brown up to be as deep as I want it to be. Odin's Eye, something that I disliked about Odin's Eye color stories for a long time is that I didn't think they had enough depth in their palettes, but the legendary Diversa collab palettes from Odin's Eye have been just absolutely stellar palettes for me. So the Hummingbird palette in collaboration with Tina, I mean, I love this deep purple. It's beautiful, and I love that this light matte blue can blend into all of these other shades, and that this purple can blend into all of these other mattes. I love it. It's just like all of these palettes are so well thought. The Red Dragon palette in collaboration with Judy. Again, it's such a beautiful neutral palette that has this lovely deep brown here, and then this shade I also find I can build up to create enough depth. And then the Giant Wolves palette in collaboration with Annette's Makeup Corner. So this is an example of a palette that doesn't have necessarily like a lighter quote-unquote transition shade, but I don't mind blending just these shadows out with like a cream matte shade or my face powder or something, and it has a matte black, which I love. And then we also have the Hella palette in collaboration with Angelica Nyqvist. I love this depth that Soot gives, but I do find myself wishing that this shade Ouroboros was deeper. I can use the shade Soot to deepen up some of these like more mid-toned, grungier, neutral leaning greens, but I do wish that this matte shade was deeper. And then Collidos is another brand actually that I find myself wanting more depth from. Most of the Collidos palettes that I actually haven't pulled for this video, but the Club Nebula palette, also in collaboration with Angelica Nyqvist, was really one of the first times that I was really excited by, and one of the reasons that I love this palette so much is that it has these deeper mattes. And then the two Futurism palettes that I have that I can use by themselves is the Futurism 2 Cyber Bronze. I love this deep brown in here. I find myself reaching for it a ton when I need just like a deep brown. I love it. And then the Futurism 5 Electro Turquoise. I can create just a look with just this palette because I do love how deep this dark brown goes, and I like This isn't actually quite as deep as I find that it looks in the pan, but I do love the depth of this dark brown, and I could create looks using this palette by itself, and I do reach for a deeper teal a lot of the times, but for all intents and purposes, like generally I can use this palette by itself. And that's it for Collidos. Colored Raine is another brand that I absolutely love because they always give me depth, and I've always loved them for that. So the older palettes that I have from them, Colored Raine, Safari Raine, again, one of the reasons that I love this palette so much is the depth. I love this deep brown. It just really has everything that I want in a palette. Same with the Colored Raine and Power palette. I've talked about this endlessly. I just love these two dark purples, and I reach for this all of the time for those shades. The Rose Garden palette, which is a newer release from them. Again, love these range of mattes, and then the pairings of the shimmers. And then the Rebellious Nudes palette really is just like encompasses the level of depth that I want my neutral palettes to have. And then I also love these shimmers at the top. Blend Bunny, again, is just a brown that I just adore. I mean, I love their eyeshadow formula, but I also adore them because they have so many deep mattes in their palettes. The Surge palette, I just, ever since I brought these into my collection, I've reached for them nonstop. I mean, look at that beautiful row. And I mean, this truly does have everything that I could ever want for an eye look, like light mattes, mid-tone mattes, deep mattes, shimmers, a matte black, flawless. And then again, the Dollhouse palette, similar to the Surge palette, light, medium, mid-toned, matte black, and then all these beautiful shimmers. I know that I could finish any look across these two palettes. Any look that I could ever imagine, I can finish or do with these two palettes. So I love that. Let's see. Let's do this just random stack here. Lorac, I have one palette from them, the Fairy Tale Forest palette. Now, I would prefer this deep brown to be a little bit deeper, but I can use it to create like a good amount of depth. And I love all of these shimmers in here, but I definitely would prefer it if this palette wasn't as light to mid-toned as it is. This palette is kind of like 50-50, half is, half isn't. The Raw Beauty Christie and Pure palette. So the neutral side is a palette that I can and have used by itself many a time. I love this deep brown, and then we have that shimmer that I can throw on the lid if I want. But the colorful side of this, I would never use this by itself. That's a lie. I actually have used it by itself once, but just in general, I would always reach for a deeper shade. If this was a matte black, then I could call this whole palette one and done, but unfortunately it's not. And then this palette, I didn't think that it would be like a one and done palette for me, but I think in a lot of ways it is. The Likely Makeup Ugly palette. Now, I love this dark green, and I can use this to deepen up the blues and the greens, but I also find that I can build this purple up enough to create the depth that I want. So I love that because these shadows just layer and build so beautifully. I found that I can create looks just using this palette alone, which I love. And then ABH, surprisingly, is a brand that I find has always given me depth, and the depth that I want all of the time, which I do really appreciate. In my opinion, and many others, ABH's best palette, the Jackie Aina palette, I mean, beautiful, no notes. The Riviera palette, for me now, isn't necessarily my preference because I don't necessarily love to deepen up colorful shadows with a brown, but I used to, and I used to use this palette a lot just by itself. Now maybe not so much, but for a lot of these neutral shades. And then honestly, I could still do looks just using this. So this is in this video as well. Subculture, I mean, say what you want about Subculture, but it really does give you the depth. I mean, look at that beautiful deep purple. I have to pull this out again and use this. Soft Glam. This has honestly been one that has stayed in my rotation since I got it and still stays in my rotation when I need a neutral palette today. I mean, deep brown and a matte black. Yes, please. And then same with Modern Renaissance. I mean, Cypress Ember is the GOAT. It's the GOAT of dark browns, okay? Fight me if you want. Speaking of older palettes, some more random older palettes that I pulled. The NYX Ultimate Shadow Palette in Phoenix. Now, as much as I really dislike the shadow formula, it does have this deeper eggplant. It has a matte black, so I can't even really criticize it too much. And when I use this palette, I do pretty much use it by itself. Some Makeup Revolution palettes. This is the Reloaded Iconic Fever. Dark brown. We do have a range of depth and we have shimmers in there. Reloaded Visionary. Again, love that depth. And there actually are surprisingly good shimmers in that palette. Reloaded Iconic Vitality. This is just because it follows the color story of Modern Renaissance, so can't give it too much credit on its own. Same with Reloaded Iconic Division. Although it does have a black, and the Subculture doesn't have a black. And then Reloaded Neutrals 3. A lot of depth in there, so I do love that. And then also the Makeup Revolution and Roxasaurus Ride or Die palette. There is this deep brown in here that I can use and have used to deepen up all of these shades. Maybe I wouldn't use it with the shade Draco, like this teal, but for 98% of the looks that I would do, use it by itself. The e.l.f. Electric Mood X Tiana Major 9 Feeling Lucky palette. Again, we have these dark shades and this matte black. The shimmers, some are good, some aren't the best. I recently uploaded a reel actually using this palette. If you want to go check that out on my Instagram. The Tarte Tartist Pro palette is one of my OGs that I love and that I used to pull all the time for this matte purple. Like, look at this deep row. Light, mid-toned, deep mattes. Same with the Urban Decay Born to Run palette. I love this range of depths and the matte black. The shimmers aren't my favorite necessarily, but they'll do in a pinch. The Too Faced Chocolate Bar palette. Again, I would probably pretty much use this mostly on its own if I used it today. Don't really use it today. And then the Urban Decay and Gwen Stefani palette. I mean, it's quite light for the most part, but there is a matte black and we do have these deeper shades down here. All right, let's go through some of my more expensive palettes. These two from the Temptalia and Sydney Grace collab. One of the palettes I didn't include, but the Quintessence palette. I love the depth in here. I love this dark gray. I love this matte black. And then the On the Horizon palette. This blue is quite deep and I love this dark brown. And again, I'd probably use a like cream shadow or face powder or something to blend these out, but no, not really a problem for me. Surprise, surprise, not really. Pretty much all of my Melt palettes are in here. So the most recent one to me is Mary Jane. I mean, yes to everything about that. Muerte is my go-to like deep shade palette. I love it to death. The Vita palette from Melt, again, I love this range of tones in here and range of depths. Gemini, again, dark brown, dark green, matte black, range of depths and mattes. We have the shimmers. Melt, the Waiting Room palette. This is the Beetlejuice collaboration they did. Love it. Love it so much. I love that deep gray. I love the dark red. It has a matte black. Absolutely adore. And then the most recent holiday collection from them, the Amore Mariposas palette. No, Mariposas. I almost tried to do the French R. Love the depth. And it has shimmers. It's beautiful in every way. Natasha Denona Golds I have and use by itself because I do find that this deep brown does deepen up by itself enough to create the depth that I want. I probably would grab a darker teal to deepen this up, but for, again, the most part, this palette has the depth and shimmers and mattes that I would use to create a full look. But I only have the Metropolis. I actually wouldn't the only other Natasha Denona palette I have is Metropolis, and I wouldn't consider Metropolis to be a standalone palette for me because I always want more depth from that. And then we have Pat McGrath, which, you know, I love her because of the depth she gives me. Bronze Seduction, Deep Purple, reach for it all the time, and Celestial Divinity. And I love that this is quite deep, and then I also can use this shade as a matte as well. Morphe, let's just get it out of the way. Am I in the middle of this frame? I hope so. The Jaclyn Hill and Morphe Vault collection, actually every single one of these palettes is pretty much a standalone palette for me. I mean, say what you will, but Jaclyn Hill does do curations of colors pretty well, I feel. The Bling Boss palette, love the depth. The, what is this called? Dark Magic. Again, I really, you know, love this as well. The shimmers in these palettes aren't my favorite, but again, they'll do in a pinch. This is the Armed and Gorgeous palette. And the Ring the Alarm palette. I mean, I just truly can. I don't need to grab for other palettes when I use those palettes. Same with the larger Jaclyn Hill and Morphe palettes. The OG palette. I mean, I'd hope. Unlike someone else's Morphe collab that doesn't have nearly enough depth. And the Volume 2. Sometimes I find that if I just use this palette for like light, medium, deep, some of the shade, like my looks can look similar, but it does have a good amount of depth in it, and I do appreciate it for that. And we are now on to my last stack of palettes. This is a random one. This is the Smashbox Cover Shot Nova palette. A little bit random, but it does have this matte black, so I could just use this by itself. The Dominique Cosmetics Berries and Cream palette. Not my favorite formula, but is a standalone palette for me. Technically, this is a standalone palette, the Lime Crime Venus, but maybe not quite, because if I'm being honest, technically I could create a full look with this, but I would probably want something more from my shimmers. And now finally, let's leave off with some Juvia's Place palettes. So the original, the Nubian, love the depth in here. The Saharan is only a standalone palette because it has a matte black that I can use to create like a base of depth. The Nomad, I absolutely love this color story. It's one of my favorite Juvia's Place palettes. I love this dark, dark, dark brown. The Tribe is another one that I really love. I might grab for a deeper brown to deepen this shade up, but again, for a lot of the looks that I make using this palette, this dark green is really nice. The Warrior palette I also really love because of this super, super deep brown. The Juice palette, again, deepening colorful shades up with a brown isn't necessarily my preference anymore, but I do love that this has this dark brown. And then finally, the Nubian 2 from Juvia's Place. I love this deep brown and this dark plum. So that concludes this video. I actually have so many palettes that I can use to create standalone looks and then use as companion palettes to the other palettes in my collection that don't have the depth or, you know, whatever that I need from them. Again, obviously, I feel like this probably has to go without saying, but I'll say it anyway. This is obviously 100% just based on me and my personal preference and what I want in an eyeshadow look. I know a ton of people don't like dark eyeshadow and only want like light to mid-tones. That's awesome, do you, but I really crave depth. I love having dark eyeshadow, and I also like to have deep eyeshadows because I like to use eyeshadow also as a way to like contour my eye when I do my eyeshadow, so I want, you know, that depth there to create that dimension. And also I just love shimmery things, so I need to have a shimmer in a palette in order for me to consider it a standalone palette. I would love to know what your go-to standalone palettes are. Are most of your palettes standalone in your collection, or also what criteria do you have for your palettes that makes your palettes like a standalone palette? Because it could be obviously completely different from mine, and I would love to know. Thank you so much for watching. As always, if you want to stick around, I upload 3, sometimes 4 videos a week, and I talk about eyeshadow and a ton of other stuff. So if you want to subscribe to me, that'd be cool. I'd appreciate it. And I'd love to see you in my next video. Bye.